Have you ever felt a place was alive? A house that watched you, breathed around you, and never wanted you to leave? Evelyn Harper, a schoolteacher with a taste for the strange and unexplained, thought she was brave enough. When she heard whispers of the Darrington Cabin, a forgotten structure deep in the woods, abandoned for decades, but rumored to hold secrets too dark to speak aloud, she had to see it for herself. Miss Evelyn Harper had always been drawn to stories that lingered on the edges of reality, the kind of tales whispered by old-timers who claimed to have glimpsed things that no one could explain. Her reputation as a schoolteacher in the small town of Harrows Creek was built on her curiosity and the way she brought history to life for her students, blending facts with the kind of folklore that made even the most skeptical children sit wide-eyed at her lectures. But when she heard murmurs of the Darrington region, a stretch of dense forest said to be cursed or haunted, depending on who told the story, she felt an irresistible pull. It wasn't just a desire to uncover history. It was a need to confront the unknown, to step where others feared to tread, and perhaps to bring back a story that no one would ever forget. The journey to Darrington was arduous, a narrow road that wound between gnarled oaks and firs that blocked the sun in thick canopies, leaving shadows to move like restless spirits across the mossy ground. Locals she encountered along the way warned her, their eyes darkened with an unease that spoke louder than words, cautioning her not to linger near the cabin that lay deep in the forest. "People go in, teacher, some never come back," an old man said, his voice gravelly, his hands trembling as though merely gesturing toward the forest might summon some unseen terror. Evelyn thanked them politely, but the warnings only fanned the flame of her resolve. She felt no fear strong enough to turn her back on what might be the discovery of a lifetime. She arrived at the edge of the forest as the sun dipped low, painting the horizon in bruised purples and oranges. Mist clung to the earth like a living thing, curling around tree trunks and obscuring the path forward. Evelyn could sense a stillness in the air, a quiet that was more than the absence of sound, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. She adjusted her satchel, checking her notebook and camera, each item a token of her preparedness, but deep down, she knew that no preparation could account for what might lie ahead. The Darrington Cabin, she had heard, had been abandoned for decades, a relic of a family who had vanished one winter without a trace. Some said it had been left to rot, a home claimed by the forest, while others whispered that those who had gone inside never truly left, their spirits trapped behind the wooden walls. Despite the unease creeping along her spine, Evelyn stepped onto the overgrown path leading to the cabin. Every step seemed to echo too loudly, carrying her forward through the thick underbrush, past roots that twisted like fingers grasping at her ankles. She felt the weight of the warnings from the villagers pressing against her chest, but she pushed on, determined to see the cabin for herself, to understand the source of its legend, and to record what the forest seemed unwilling to reveal to ordinary eyes. Each branch that snapped beneath her boots seemed to mark the threshold of the unknown, a transition from the world she understood into a realm that refused explanation, where curiosity was both a gift and a risk. The moment Evelyn Harper finally glimpsed the Darrington Cabin, her breath caught in her throat, not entirely from exertion, but from a mix of awe and unease that tightened around her chest like a vice. It appeared almost impossibly intact, as if the forest had deliberately preserved it despite decades of neglect. Moss crept along the corners of its weathered wooden siding, and the roof sagged slightly, yet there were no signs of the decay she had expected. Windows, grimy with years of dust and dirt, reflected the waning light of the sun, and yet through one of them, a faint flicker danced as though a candle, or perhaps a lantern, was burning inside. It was impossible, she told herself. No one lived here, no one had for generations, and yet the cabin exuded a warmth and presence that felt unnaturally alive. The clearing around it was unervingly quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies the smallest sounds until they become deafening. Evelyn's own heartbeat thudded in her ears, mingling with the soft rustle of leaves, a whisper of wind that felt more like a sigh escaping from the forest itself. Every instinct screamed that this place was not just abandoned, but that it watched her, assessed her, and perhaps had been waiting for her arrival. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the clearing, flickering as though they belonged to some other realm where the laws of light and time did not follow the rules she knew. The cabin's door hung slightly ajar, inviting and foreboding at once, as if it were offering her a choice she could not refuse, a path that had been waiting for her steps long before she ever knew of its existence. Evelyn's curiosity, the same force that had guided her through history and folklore for so long, battled with a growing sense of dread. She stepped closer, her boots crunching over fallen leaves, and felt a shift in the air, a weight pressing against her shoulders that was difficult to define. It was as though the forest itself leaned toward the cabin, funneling her attention to the structure with an almost sentient urgency. She noted the intricate carvings on the doorframe, half-eroded symbols that seemed to writhe in the dimming light, and photographs that had been nailed to the walls outside, now faded and curling at the edges. Their subjects were indistinct, figures caught in smiles that no longer reached the eyes, and yet Evelyn could not tear her gaze away. For a moment, she considered retreating, returning to the safety of the village and the rational world she knew. Yet the flickering light in the window, the unnatural stillness of the clearing, and the sense that the cabin had been waiting for her made her step forward. Every sense was heightened, the smell of damp earth and rotting wood, the taste of cold air on her tongue, the way the shadows seemed to twitch just beyond her vision. She paused at the threshold, hand hovering over the door, feeling the pulse of something unseen behind the walls. And in that moment, she realized the forest had already claimed her attention, her thoughts, her presence, drawing her into a story she was about to become a part of. Evelyn Harper hesitated only for a moment before crossing the threshold of the Darrington Cabin, the wooden floorboards groaning beneath her weight as if voicing their protest. The warmth inside was immediate, a heavy, unnatural heat that contrasted sharply with the chill of the forest outside. Dust hung thick in the air, caught in the fading light that filtered through the grimy windows, giving the space an almost otherworldly glow. The smell was pungent, damp wood, old smoke, and something else she could not identify, something metallic and faintly sweet that set her nerves on edge. Every instinct told her to retreat, to leave before curiosity became obsession, but she felt rooted to the spot, unable to resist the strange allure that the cabin radiated. As she stepped deeper inside, her eyes were drawn to the walls, where faded photographs hung crookedly in wooden frames. The images were of a family, a mother and father with children, their smiles frozen, their eyes darkened, scratched out as though someone had tried to erase their presence from memory. It was a detail that felt deliberate, purposeful, and it made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She traced a finger along one of the pictures, the glass cold and sticky beneath her touch, and a shiver traveled down her spine. The photographs were arranged in chronological order, showing children growing older, yet the eyes remained blacked out, as if time had passed for everyone else but had deliberately spared these souls from life. The furniture was sparse, covered in dust sheets that were moth-eaten and fragile. A cracked rocking chair sat near the fireplace, which held remnants of old ashes that had not felt warmth in decades. The air seemed to pulse with a rhythm of its own, subtle but persistent, like the heartbeat of the house itself. Evelyn could hear the soft creak of wood above her, though she knew no one else could be there. Every step she took seemed magnified in the oppressive silence, echoing unnaturally, as if the cabin was aware of her movements, cataloging them, learning her presence. On a table near the back wall lay a scattering of books and papers, yellowed and brittle, their ink faded. She picked up one carefully, her fingers trembling, and read passages that spoke of the family's daily life, their hopes and fears, and strange warnings that no outsider should linger too long. The words were simple, yet carried an undertone of desperation, as if the writer had known something was coming, something that would not allow them to leave. Outside, the light was fading, but inside, the cabin seemed to absorb the dusk, growing darker with each passing second. Evelyn felt a strange vertigo, a pull toward the deeper shadows where corners of the room seemed to stretch impossibly, hiding spaces that should not exist, and she realized with a thrill of dread that she had already crossed a boundary she could never truly return from. As Evelyn Harper wandered deeper into the cabin, a faint, almost imperceptible sound brushed against her ear, so light that she first assumed it was the wind slipping through the cracks in the old wooden walls. It was a whisper, soft and broken, almost like a sigh, but it carried the unmistakable cadence of speech. She froze, straining to hear, but the words dissolved before they fully formed, leaving only a lingering sense of unease. The forest outside was silent, yet inside the cabin, it felt alive, a living presence that breathed and watched, aware of every movement she made. Her pulse quickened, and a chill crept down her spine as she realized the whispers were coming from within, from the very walls around her. At first, Evelyn tried to dismiss it as imagination, the product of her own overactive curiosity mingling with the natural eeriness of the place. But the whispers persisted, growing clearer, though fragmented. Names, dates, fleeting phrases, "Don't leave, they are here. We tried." They brushed her consciousness in irregular, unsettling rhythms. They seemed to be speaking directly to her, recounting events she had never known, tragedies and vanishings connected to the cabin. She felt an inexplicable tug, a mixture of dread and fascination, compelling her to listen closer, to understand what the voices were trying to convey. Every instinct screamed for her to run, yet her curiosity anchored her feet to the dust-covered floorboards. The more she moved through the space, the more the whispers shaped themselves into stories of the past, of a family consumed by some unseen force, each member vanishing under mysterious circumstances. The air thickened with a sense of urgency, the temperature dropping and rising in waves, as though the cabin itself were breathing in tandem with the tales being whispered. Shadows seemed to ripple at the edges of her vision, flickering unnaturally, as though the very light was bending to accommodate the presence of voices only she could hear. Evelyn's heart pounded as the whispers grew urgent, almost pleading, warning her that outsiders rarely left once they had crossed the threshold. Her mind raced, caught between skepticism and the mounting evidence that something beyond explanation had taken root here long ago. The sensation of being watched intensified, and the soft murmurs now felt like hands brushing against her consciousness, guiding her attention toward corners of the room she had not yet explored. She realized that the cabin was not merely abandoned. It was alive with memory, with intent, and with a malevolent persistence that seemed to have been waiting for her arrival. Every whisper carried fragments of the past, fragments that tugged at her curiosity with a force that was impossible to resist. And as she stood in the center of the cabin, listening to the voices that had lain dormant for decades, she understood that she had stepped into a world where the boundary between the living and the lost was fragile, and that the cabin would not let her leave without first claiming her attention, her fear, and perhaps something far more permanent that it was while tracing. The far corner of the cabin that Evelyn Harper's fingers brushed against a section of wall that felt oddly uneven, a subtle vibration that set her senses on edge. With careful pressure, she discovered a narrow panel, warped and splintered with age, that shifted under her touch to reveal a hidden room beyond. The air that escaped was colder than the rest of the cabin, carrying the scent of decay and something metallic, a faint tang that made her stomach knot. She hesitated for only a heartbeat before stepping through, the floor creaking beneath her, a warning or perhaps a prelude to what lay ahead. Inside, the space was cramped, walls lined with shelves of yellowed journals and brittle letters, all meticulously arranged, as if someone, or something, had wanted the stories preserved for whoever might find them. Evelyn picked up the first journal, its cover cracked, ink faded, and began reading. The entries told of strange occurrences that had begun subtly, objects moving on their own, whispers at night, and the pervasive sensation of being watched. Each page became darker, detailing family members disappearing without explanation, their absence marked only by empty chairs and untouched meals. Symbols were etched into floors and walls, strange runes that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, though their meaning was indecipherable. The journals carried warnings too, cautions scrawled hastily in the margins: "Do not linger. The house remembers. The house waits." Evelyn's curiosity surged even as dread coiled in her stomach. She could not tear herself away from the chronicles of despair, the evidence of lives caught in something beyond comprehension. A sudden sound made her jump, a soft scratching, almost like fingernails on wood, echoing from somewhere deep within the cabin. Her breath quickened, heart hammering in her chest. The shadows in the corners of the room flickered as if stirred by an unseen hand, and she felt an instinctive awareness that the hidden room itself was alive, its walls bearing witness to decades of suffering. Each journal she opened seemed to respond, the words rearranging themselves subtly in the flickering candlelight, recounting more events she had not read before, fragments of tragedy that painted a pattern of inescapable doom. She realized that these writings were not merely records. They were invitations, lures for anyone who entered the cabin, guiding them into the same history of loss and disappearance. Time lost meaning as she continued to read. The whispers she had first heard now louder, more coherent, threading through the words of the journals. They described the house as sentient, a presence that drew people inside, holding them until the boundaries between the living and the vanished blurred. Evelyn felt a growing vertigo, a sense that the cabin was watching her very thoughts, absorbing her fear and curiosity in equal measure. Every shadow seemed to stretch, every floorboard grown a message, and she understood with a creeping clarity that this hidden room was not a refuge but a trap, a chamber of memory and warning, its stories preserved to ensnare the unwary. And as she reached for another letter, a faint movement in the corner of her eye made her freeze, sensing that whatever had been recording these tragedies for decades now acknowledged her presence, and she was no longer just a visitor, but a participant in the cabin's dark and enduring history. As dusk settled over the forest, the Darrington Cabin seemed to grow heavier around Evelyn Harper, the shadows inside thickening and twisting in ways that defied logic. She moved toward the door, intending to leave, but found it stubbornly jammed, as if the wood itself had swollen with purpose. The handle refused to turn, and every push only made a low, mournful groan echo through the cabin, vibrating deep into her chest. Panic began to settle in, gnawing at her reason. She pounded on the door, called out for help, but her voice seemed swallowed, absorbed by the very walls, leaving only the suffocating silence that pressed down on her from all directions. The air was oppressive, heavy with the scent of decay and smoke, a suffocating mixture that made her lungs ache. Through the grimy windows, Evelyn could see the forest beyond, but the shapes of trees shifted unnaturally. Figures moved at the edges of her vision, flickering glimpses of human shapes, or something that resembled humans, always just beyond her ability to focus. They watched, unmoving, their presence suggested rather than fully revealed, like shadows cast by an unseen fire. The whispers she had heard earlier returned, louder now, insistent, almost angry, repeating phrases she could barely comprehend. "Do not leave. Stay forever." They rose and fell like waves, surrounding her, threading through the cabin like a tangible current. Evelyn pressed her hands to her ears, but it made no difference. The sound was inside her skull now, merging with her heartbeat and breath until she could no longer tell what was real and what belonged to the house. The low, guttural hum that she first felt beneath the floorboards earlier intensified, vibrating through the soles of her feet and into her bones. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, yet the cabin seemed to resist her every attempt. The temperature shifted unpredictably. One moment, a cold shiver raced along her spine. The next, heat prickled her skin as if the house itself were alive and aware of her presence. The shadows in the corners began to twist toward her, elongating unnaturally, forming shapes that were not quite human, not quite animal, but somehow intelligent, aware, and waiting. Evelyn's vision blurred as her heart hammered, and she realized the forest outside was no longer a refuge. It was as if the cabin had stretched its influence, a living presence that reached beyond its walls, binding her to its fate. Desperation clawed at her mind as she scanned the room for any means of escape, but the more she looked, the more the cabin seemed to rearrange itself subtly, corridors appearing where none had existed, corners stretching impossibly, trapping her within an architecture that was neither fixed nor logical. Every sound, the whispering, the creaking, the subtle scraping from behind walls, seemed directed, intentional, guiding her fear towards something she could not yet see. And in that realization, that horrifying awareness, Evelyn understood that the cabin's purpose was not to shelter, not to preserve, but to ensnare, to pull those who entered into a web of dread and isolation from which there might be no return. Evelyn Harper's panic intensified as the evening deepened into an oppressive darkness that seemed to seep into every corner of the Darrington cabin. The whispers had grown insistent, almost sentient, threading through her mind and calling her name in tones that were both familiar and alien, as if the cabin itself had learned the cadence of her voice. Every attempt to open the door failed. The handle twisted in her hand but would not budge, and when she slammed her shoulder against it, the wooden frame shuddered but remained immovable, as though resisting her departure. The low hum vibrating through the floorboards now pulsed in time with her heartbeat, and she felt it seep into her bones, a warning or a countdown she could not decipher. She called out, her voice hoarse from shouting, but the echoes that returned were not hers alone. They carried strange distortions, whispers layered over whispers, as if the house were mocking her attempts to escape, repeating her fear back to her, fragmenting her thoughts. Figures flitted past the windows, visible for only fractions of a second, shapes humanoid but grotesquely elongated, their limbs bending at impossible angles. The shadows inside the cabin mirrored them, stretching and writhing in the corners, moving with an intelligence that was both terrifying and deliberate. Evelyn tried to shield her eyes, but the movement was unavoidable. It pressed on her perception, making her question every shape, every flicker of light, every sound in the suffocating room. Her gaze fell to the journals and letters she had found earlier, scattered across the floor as if the cabin itself had tossed them in response to her struggle. The words seemed to writhe on the pages, forming new sentences, phrases she had not read before. Stay, stay forever. It remembers, it wants you. A cold realization gripped her. This was not just a house. It was alive in ways she could not comprehend, and it had marked her as part of its history. The room seemed to shrink around her, corners bending, ceilings dipping, shadows curling toward her like dark fingers. Every instinct screamed that she had crossed a boundary, that the cabin's purpose was not observation but consumption, a living trap designed to ensnare and absorb those who dared enter. Minutes, or hours, passed, though she could not tell, as the oppressive weight of the house pressed in from all sides. Her calls became frantic, then desperate whispers, blending with the voices that had claimed the space long before her arrival. When the last faint light from outside slipped beneath the horizon, the cabin seemed to pulse with satisfaction, as though it had drawn her fully into its world. No footprints led from the cabin, no trace of Evelyn remained outside. Months later, hikers would find her journals, her bag, her notes, each page ending abruptly mid-thought, her words frozen where she had left off. The final line, unfinished, simply read, "I think it wants me," and then silence, the cabin's claim complete, leaving only a lingering terror in the minds of those who later approached the forest, wary of the Darrington cabin that refused to release those who entered. Long after Evelyn Harper vanished, the Darrington cabin remained, an enigmatic relic at the edge of the forest that seemed untouched by time, yet alive in ways no outsider could fully grasp. Locals spoke of it in hushed tones, their voices dropping when the forest came into view, as if the mere mention of the cabin might draw its attention. Some claimed that on certain nights, a faint light glimmered through the grime-streaked windows, pulsing rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. Others swore they could hear whispers echoing from the trees themselves, fragments of a voice that called their names, promised knowledge, or threatened endless confinement. The story of Evelyn Harper had become woven into the cabin's legend, her disappearance serving as both warning and evidence of the cabin's enduring, sinister presence. Occasionally, daring individuals, curious hikers, amateur paranormal investigators, or folklorists like Evelyn once was, ventured near the clearing. They would report the same oppressive atmosphere, the feeling of being watched, and the odd shifting of shadows at the periphery of vision. Some said they could hear faint scratching, like fingernails on wood, from within the walls, or a low hum that vibrated through their chests and left them unsteady on their feet. Attempts to approach the cabin often ended with retreat, as if an unseen force repelled them, guiding them back into the relative safety of the forest. Those who lingered too long sometimes returned with tales of whispers, unintelligible phrases, or a chilling sense that the cabin remembered them, cataloging their presence for reasons impossible to understand. The locals' accounts grew more detailed over time, each retelling layered with new observations that painted the cabin as something more than abandoned, a place alive with memory, with intent, with an inexplicable force that drew in the curious and left them marked. Children passing near the forest would sometimes point toward the cabin and shiver, insisting they saw figures moving behind the windows, though no one was supposed to live there. Hunters and trappers reported equipment mysteriously displaced, or supplies vanishing after a night spent near the clearing. Even animals avoided the vicinity, their instincts apparently warning them of the unseen threat. The cabin became a symbol of fear and fascination, a story repeated in towns and whispered in classrooms, libraries, and around campfires. Evelyn Harper's disappearance remained the most compelling detail, the event that transformed a simple abandoned house into a legend with teeth. Her journals, discovered months later by hikers who dared approach too closely, provided fragmented insight into her final hours, accounts of whispers, shifting shadows, and an oppressive, sentient presence, but no explanation for her vanishing. Over time, the cabin's reputation solidified. It was not simply abandoned. It was a trap, an entity that consumed curiosity, a structure that seemed to feed on attention, anchoring the missing to its walls. And so, it remained at the edge of the forest, a place alive in ways no one fully understood, its history growing with every whispered tale, every fearful glance from the clearing, and every new visitor who approached with curiosity, unaware that the cabin had already begun its silent claim on them.